Hello, everybody out there, out in Twitter or YouTube or wherever you happen to be watching this video. I'm going to be making it fairly platform agnostic so that I can release it, wherever I feel like. I've never done this before. This doesn't fit within the criteria or category of any of my previous videos. It's not a review. Certainly, it's not a vlog entry. It's really what this is just kind of, it's really no surprise or secret that right now the world of the film industry, especially in regards to digital social media, is going through a bit of a dark time. And I feel like my privilege precludes me from being able to really weigh in on that in any way that would be meaningful or helpful to add to the dialogue, add to the discussion. It's one that, being a white cis male, I feel like my voice is not the one that needs to be heard, so I don't mind stepping back. But what I will do, what I want to do, I feel like when there's a bit of a negative atmosphere going on, that sometimes it helps, as far as the entirety and the general community goes, to provide a little bit of positivity and try to just make things a little bit brighter. And I know that one thing within the horror film community especially that constantly gets talked about is our history with horror, how we grew up with it, and so on. So I kind of wanted to offer what I think, to me, at the very least, is an amusing anecdote as far as my previous experience with horror, my upbringing with it, and a little segment of me. And I don't know, I kind of want to just put some positivity out in the world and hope that maybe it shines a little bit of a brighter light on somebody's day out there. And the last thing I'll say to preface this anecdote is there's really no hidden subtext in here. There's no real hidden meaning. There's no real point to any of this. This is just me offering up a little bit of the history of Mike in a way that I think might be at least somewhat amusing, somewhat entertaining for the horror community out there. Maybe my subscribers want to know me a little bit better. Maybe this is a way to make that happen. That's all I'm doing. So, okay. So my experience with horror kind of goes back to a very early age. I was born in 1980, and there were several films in the 1980s that my father took me to in the theater that I think were honestly pretty questionable. I remember seeing Aliens in the theater. I remember seeing The Gate in the theater. I remember having nightmares, and I remember having difficulties, and I remember there were several scenes in which it's an example of when memory takes over reality. One example of that is when I was growing up, I was traumatized by The Fly. I don't remember if I saw that in the theater or if it was on VHS, but I remember I saw it damned early. And there was one scene that I couldn't get out of my head. It was clear as day in the visual picture of my brain and my memory of the scene where they were doing the arm wrestling. And it was very clear to me that Jeff Goldblum, as The Fly, as Brundle, ripped the guy's arm off. And it was very surprising to me when I was older and I decided to rewatch this film that had scarred me, that, in the arm wrestling scene, no, it's just a compound fracture. It didn't rip the guy's arm clean off. But I remember seeing it that way. And it's just really interesting to me how memories can kind of fill in the gaps. And, it's always said that we're not remembering an instance, we're remembering the last memory of the instance. And every time we have recall, it changes a little bit more. And, in that regard, memory is a very faulty medium, but that's getting off point. Somewhat on point. So I remember that I had a dream. It was a signature nightmare. I don't know if anybody else is like this, but there are probably, I would say, maybe a half dozen or so really signature nightmares that have stuck with me and are still with me to this day, as far as just remembering how traumatizing this particular nightmare was for me. And when I describe it, it really doesn't sound that awful bad, but man, did it get me. I had it at a young age. It was when I was in the single digit age group, and there was two confluence of events, two scenes within this nightmare that I recall, and both were rather goopy. One was I remember that I opened the front door and my parents were standing outside, out on the front step, and they were waiting for me there, and their faces melted off. And that was jarring. That was scary. But then I ran inside and I went to the bathroom, and I found that the door was ajar. And when I opened it, my uncle was in there, and he looked at me, and all of a sudden, as he's looking at me, his eyes fall out, and a yellow goop starts coming out of the sockets. And the real thing that stuck with me about that, more than the face melting, more than the eyes falling out, more than the goop, was his attitude about it. It was very, he was not in any way, roar, anything like that. It was very much along the lines of somebody just spilling their peanut butter parfait. It was very, matter of fact, and, oh, geez, okay, well, get a towel. Oh, sorry about that, my bad. And I remember, I woke up, and it was bad. I didn't want to go to sleep for the next several weeks. And, sleep became a problem for me after that. But, after a few weeks, things settled down. But it was always one that stuck with me. When I mentioned that I had seen Aliens in theater and I'd seen The Gate in the theater, The Gate was one that I kind of sort of recall. I remember how traumatizing it was without any real specific instances. I remembered The Gate itself underneath the old tree in the ground in the backyard, that kind of thing, but I really didn't remember a whole lot else from there. And then some years pass, decades pass. Honestly, about 2 decades after I had seen The Gate, the one and only time that I had seen it, because it was so splintered in my brain about this traumatizing viewing that I just never really had much inclination to go back and revisit that aspect of my youth. Other horror films, fine, bring it on. But that was one I was always a little bit trepidatious about. And about the time that I started really having, I don't know, I guess you would call it a resurgence or a renaissance of my horror movie lover self, was after high school. During high school, I Event Horizon. I've already mentioned that in my, several videos now. I liked horror, but it wasn't until after high school that I started really getting into it, and that started with Evil Dead 2, and it just really grew from there. That's when the encyclopedic knowledge and the mass exposure to horror films started building up, and about that time, I still would not watch The Gate. And there was an event that happened in my life, and I'm not going to describe the event. It was a breakup. I was going through a breakup, and as part of the self-care portion of this, now that I had all this free time, I decided that I was going to go ahead and watch as much horror as I possibly could. And I finally decided to watch The Gate. And this was probably 2.5 decades after I had seen it in the theater. And then all of a sudden, I'm watching it, and the kid opens up the door, and on the front steps, his parents are waiting for him, and their face melts off. And all of a sudden, this traumatizing dream that I had when I was a kid, all of a sudden made sense. All of a sudden, just 2 decades of mystery cleared up in a single moment of absolute cinematic clarity. This is the confluence of the 2 traumatizing things, both watching The Gate and having this nightmare. They were absolutely both related, and that's where it came from. And another thing that I kind of thought after rewatching The Gate was how juvenile it was. It was honestly kind of like horror light, but that's neither here. It was interesting to see, not only connecting this traumatizing thing, but also finding it in such a lightweight, almost whimsical juvenile horror film. And I was like, this is what did that. So, I don't know. I guess that was a little bit interesting. It was at the very least a little slice of Mike, a little bit slice of, rotted reviews and who I am and some of my backstory with the history of horror there. So, I don't know. Like I said, I just kind of wanted to relay an anecdote, put some positivity back out in the air, and see what you thought. At the very least, maybe, hopefully, I made somebody smile out there. If so, awesome. So that should about do it. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you at my next video, which is probably going to be released Friday with another 5 horror movies you probably have never heard of. Thank you again, and please take the advice of two of the smartest individuals that have ever graced the silver screen and be excellent to each other.